We're going to open it up in just 1 minute. I have one more question here, which is the markets got very excited and concerned this summer when it looked as if Chinese growth was weakening, or it finally realized Chinese growth was weakening. How big a concern does China represent to you about the overall outlook for global growth and U.S. growth?
Well, China is a very big player. It's a major consumer of almost every major commodity you can think of. Remember, China is positioned probably 50 years behind us. I mean, we went through, I remember when, I used to drive up the southern shore of Lake Michigan, and you had one steel company after the other in the 1950s and 60s. They're gone. You had a huge amount of commodity production, and the physical, I actually went in one of my earlier books, measured the physical weight of the GDP. And the weight of the GDP was either stable or going up virtually year by year until basically in the 60s, it's starting to flatten out. And the actual physical weight, in other words, we had a huge downsizing revolution. Physical weight is not much different from what it was 20, 30 years ago. China is still in the early stages of this. The reason why you can't go to Beijing without choking is this sounds like what I went through. I remember walking down the streets in Triangle in Pittsburgh in 1951, and my shoes would crunch. It was coke oven coal debris, and the smokestacks were all over the place. And I'd look at it and I'd say, boy, this is a real measure of American industrial capability. Until the environmental movement came on and said, that wasn't so. But this is what China is going through. In other words, they're moving where we were. Now, that means that they are the key controller, as we were back then, of the commodity, the physical part. They're the biggest manufacturer. They're the largest steel producer, by far the biggest consumer of oil and most other, I shouldn't say not oil, but a whole series of other commodities. And they've got a long way to go, but their weakening now is being caused by the fact that China is becoming a more and more, you'll excuse the expression, capitalist economy. The markets are expanding dramatically. The way they handled that stock market crash indicated to me that they hadn't a clue what they were doing. So that this is getting away from them. They are moving towards capitalism at a very rapid pace, and I don't think they are acutely aware of the extent to which that's happening. And it's periodically you run into cycles. And the first sign that I saw that something very different was going on was when the price of iron ore in Australia all of a sudden started to come down. And that meant, essentially, since the major consumer of iron ore at the time was China, something was slowing in China. And it's all accumulated from there and devastated a goodly part of the emerging world, not to mention indirectly the ECB, rather the Euro area, and the United States, but not as great as they're impacting on the emerging.
And before they controlled growth through an accounting identity, right? They would increase spending to the state enterprises and GDP would rise. And now what you're saying is it's much more variable and inside the capitalist and market system.
Just remember what's happened is that 30, 40 years ago, the State Council, which is essentially the cabinet of China, would order a province, for example, to build 20 buildings. Don't ask what they were, because the purpose of the building them was to create the jobs, not to get the space that you might think they wanted. And they then said to a government-owned commercial bank, you fund it. So that if you apply standard national income accounting to China, that's GDP.
Would rise.
And so that they could set the level of GDP as they chose by calibrating their capital investment. What's been happening since is that they've gradually moved away. They've opened up a lot of the markets and had an extraordinary pace which they didn't expect. I mean, they did not expect that big surge that came on. The reason I spoke to them beforehand, and they said no, they didn't expect much. They were surprised, I think, by it. And now we're running into the effects of, remember that they dipped their toes in allowing creative destruction to work, meaning allowing firms to default. Then they got cold feet.
They didn't like it.
They didn't like it.
Let's open the floor to questions. One of the great things about these CFR breakfasts. Let me start right here with this young lady.